It's hardly surprising that mariners would have a whole host of superstitions and folklore about seafaring. After all, in earlier centuries, bad weather, poor communications with land, and disease could bring havoc to any journey. Folklore both preserves ideas about what sailors feared and provides protections to keep dangers at bay. Of course, what sounds like superstition to us was a set of practices to give a feeling of control over their situation. And of course, folklore also maintains the legends of lost vessels that return to haunt the waters in which they were lost. So get yourself settled and we'll explore omens related to seafaring, tales of ghost ships and other hazards that might occur on the high seas in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are off to the high seas for this week's episode because we are going to be having a look at some seafaring superstitions and legends as part of this month's theme of the folklore of transport. It's sort of kind of gone a little bit off this time because I was a bit stuck between sailing and obviously a lot of the superstitions are actually to do with fishing, but I thought, well, it still involves going from A to B, so we're just going to include it anyway. Now, obviously, as I said in the introduction, a lot of the time superstitions are basically there so that you feel like you've got a level of control over what's going on around you. So you might think, if I always wear this lucky whatever, then I will always have good luck. Obviously, the more that you wear it and things go well, then it ends up cementing in your head that so and such a thing must cause your good luck, and then thus the superstition is born. And that is essentially, I think, what has happened with a lot of these stories that we're about to have a look at, that people have developed these practices and then because they have apparently worked or they've gotten the desired result, they've then decided that it was as a result of the practice, not in spite of. So we're going to actually just get straight into it because there is quite a lot to cover. And obviously there's a lot of ghost ships I haven't been able to include just purely for the length of these episodes. But otherwise, let's get into it. Now we're going to start off with a lot of the links between seafaring and luck because that is where a lot of superstitions seem to start, and the big one that I kept coming across time and again was the idea that sailors considered it unlucky to start a voyage on a Friday. Now this sometimes seems to be because the crucifixion was apparently on a Friday, but ultimately it was just you didn't do anything to do with ships on a Friday. Whether it was building them, whether it was launching them, whether it was setting sail in them, you just didn't do it on a Friday. Now, I should also point out that in the Highlands, the belief actually explained that you shouldn't take new boats to sea for the first time on a Friday, so it was a little bit more specific. Now, because of this, obviously it does then mean that if your best day for sailing is on a Friday and people don't want to sail because it's a Friday, then that is obviously going to delay voyages and things like that. So there is a somewhat apocryphal legend that claims the British Navy want to delay this particular superstition to rest once and for all. So to do so, they apparently launched the HMS Friday on a Friday, which set sail for its maiden voyage on a Friday. The fact that it was apparently never seen again seems to outweigh their intention. That being said, nobody can actually find any mention of an HMS Friday that was launched on a Friday and never seen again, and this particular legend was also ascribed to a ship owner in Connecticut as well who simply named the vessel Friday. So no evidence exists to suggest that that was ever true either, but this idea of a ship being named Friday and all that kind of jazz has been repeated so often that it basically cements the sheer weight of negative beliefs around Fridays and sailing. Now, shipwrights could actually affect the look of the vessel during the building process, and they would invariably use ash or rowan to make up part of the boat, and they would also build a gold coin into the framework and put a silver coin under the mast in order to help assure the look of the vessel as well. And beyond that, the shipwright might tie, and I quote, a red ribbon round the first nail he used to protect the boat against accidents, end quote. So there's this idea of building superstition almost into the boat itself to help ensure it have a good lifespan and so on once it's actually set off on its way. Now, there are obviously certain superstitions that I think we all know about, the idea of women being considered bad luck on board a ship unless it was in port. But some sailors also thought it was bad luck to see a woman, particularly a red-haired woman, on their way to their fishing boat. And also there were quite a lot of superstitions around sailors hating to see clergymen on their way to the boat. And it even got so bad that in some places people wouldn't even sail until the following day if they had seen a clergyman on the way to the wharf. Like I say, women were considered bad luck, but Pliny, who's obviously mentioned quite regularly on Fabulous Folklore, claimed that a bare-breasted woman had the power to calm angry seas, and this apparently explains why sailing ships often have bare-breasted women as figureheads. So apparently if you're ever at sea in the middle of a storm, then you basically just have to flash it, and therefore you would be able to calm the oceans. Have you ever tried that? If so, please do let me know. There are other things that you can see on the way to the ship which would actually bring you good luck, and that would be if you saw a horse or a grouse. Apparently they both brought good luck in the Highlands. If you stepped onto a ship left foot first, that would bring bad luck, and then also seeing rats leaving a ship was considered a negative omen. It's not necessarily a sinking ship, but just seeing rats leave one was considered bad luck. That said, if you had a child born on the ship, that was apparently a good omen. I'm sure you're probably wondering along with me that if you're going to have a child born on the ship, then wouldn't that rather imply the existence of a woman? But there we go, this is how contradictory folklore can be. Now there are obviously a very specific type of omen associated with boats, and that's the death omen. And it was important to not take flowers on board ship because they were actually intended for funerals. And likewise, any ringing noises were considered bad luck because they were also associated with funeral tolls. There was, however, an exception made for ringing bells to tell the time or to alert a changing of the watch. But a ship's bell that was ringing on its own meant that somebody would die. For those who did die at sea, there is the age-old story about the body being wrapped in a shroud and then thrown overboard. And you'll probably have heard the stories about sailmakers making the shroud and then they sew the body into it, and then they would put the final stitch through the nose to make sure that the person was indeed dead, presumably because somebody who wasn't would go ow at the moment that the needle went in. Keeping a corpse on board was considered bad luck, which helped to explain the desire to bury people at sea. Although, in all honesty, if we look at this from a point of view of just sheer practicality, I think most people would probably just simply want to avoid a decomposing body. You can see why you would want to get rid of a corpse as a result. Now, you might be wondering why the sailmaker had to make a shroud. Basically, crews didn't take empty coffins on board because they feared that one of them might end up in it. So I guess in this case, it's a little bit like you don't want to tempt fate. Now, strangely, sailors apparently often never made any effort to rescue drowning colleagues, and this was apparently due to the belief that doing so would cheat the sea of its due, meaning that they may be drowned instead of the person that they rescued. Many sailors originally didn't learn to swim either, so as not to rob the sea of a soul. But weirdly, that didn't actually stop them from buying corals, which is the membrane that babies can sometimes be born in, because owning one was believed to protect the holder from death by drowning, and there was quite a steady trade in these at one point for people who went to sea wanting to make sure that they wouldn't die by drowning. Sailors believed that birds, particularly the albatross, carried the souls of the dead, and killing an albatross therefore brought bad luck. Now, Coleridge immortalised this in Rime of the Ancient Mariner because a sailor kills an albatross and then has nothing but misfortune and tragedy afterwards. But then in some coastal areas, people actually link the souls of drowned sailors with seagulls rather than albatrosses, and as a result, no one should kill seagulls either. Now, that said, the first record of that particular belief about seagulls only dates to 1878, and I'm going to hazard a guess that whoever wrote it had obviously not met the really, really aggressive ones that you get at British coastal towns now, which won't just try and beg for food, they'll almost steal it off you. Now, as far as the albatross goes, there was actually one particular story from slightly more recent times which did appear to confirm the legend that killing an albatross was bad luck, and that was to do with the British freighter Calpian Star, which was bringing animals to a zoo in Germany, which included an albatross. Now, one of the crew, for some weird reason, fed the albatross a sausage and it died, and in August 1962 it set sail only for the generators to fail, and then the ship eventually lost power and basically ended up just simply drifting across the sea. After damaging a rudder in the Antarctic, it then ran aground in Montevideo's harbour. The engine room exploded and the crew had to abandon the ship. And strangely, they actually found one of the sailors floating face down in the water, although he hadn't been killed by the explosion. No one actually knew what had killed him, although some did go on to suspect the curse of the albatross. And obviously, if you've seen the Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe film The Lighthouse, obviously there's a lot of stuff in there about seagulls and bad luck and all that kind of thing. Now, obviously, one of the things that sailors would fear at sea are storms, and there are obviously a range of superstitions and beliefs around storms and also raising them, weirdly enough. Now, you weren't supposed to clap on board a ship because people believed that it invited thunder, and meanwhile you didn't take umbrellas on board in case it conjured up bad weather. And also, for some strange reason, sailors didn't throw stones into the sea lest it caused a storm, although you could get a modicum of storm protection by nailing a horseshoe to the mast. And this is where it gets a little bit strange, because you think, okay, so I'm going to try and have nice calm weather and so on. And people obviously used to have a prohibition against whistling because that could apparently raise a gale on board. But at the same time, some sailors would obviously then whistle to raise wind when they were in calm waters and wanted to get somewhere a bit more quickly. Now, Morag Cameron actually explains that sailors were supposed to sing rather than whistle so as not to accidentally raise a storm, but they could buy wind from a wise woman if they did want to raise wind at some point on their journey. Now, in Scotland, as in other places, this took the form of buying a knotted thread or handkerchief, and each of the 3 knots would raise a different level of wind. So if you would untie 1 knot, you would get a gentle breeze. If you then untied the 2nd knot, you would get a strong wind. And then if you untied the 3rd knot, you would get a gale. Untying the knots too quickly was, as Cameron puts it, the only danger. And the sale of these items provided a steady trade for old women in parts of Scotland. You can only assume that people must have believed that they actually worked, otherwise why would they continue to buy them? But there are occasionally tales of somebody accidentally untying all of them quite quickly and then a storm really raising rather sharply. So clearly people were trying to avoid bad weather where possible, and a superstition from sea houses in the northeast of England explained that bad weather was coming when you could hear the seals barking on the Farne Islands. Meanwhile, on the shores of East Lothian, sailors thought that seeing a little orc foretold rough weather at sea. And there are also tales about if you see like puffins coming back into land, it means that there's a storm at sea and things like that as well. So there's a lot of omens around the behaviour of birds and what the weather's doing, which is obviously based on observation because the birds don't want to be at sea in a storm either. Now, strangely, amid all of these dangers and omens and terrible things and so on, there was actually a seafaring spirit who was actually a good omen if you were lucky enough to have one on board your vessel. And that was the Klabouterman, who was a kobold that helped out on boats in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. Now, according to the legends, this helpful little spirit is a joyous creature, diligent in its duties, and even rescues any sailors that go overboard. There are descriptions of the Klabouterman that includes his little yellow outfit and pipe, and he's basically described as being a really small, like child-sized figure. But there's a bit of a problem with these descriptions because the crew themselves never actually see him. And that's a good thing because according to the legend, he only appears to the crew on a doomed ship. So if you had a voyage and you never saw the Klabouterman, that was actually a good thing. Now, according to Walter Havernick, the spirit actually belonged to the ship's captain. And Havernick claims that the ship's captain would carry the Klabouterman onto the ship in a box and it would protect the ship as long as it was on board. Obviously, where you have good spirits, you also end up with bad ones as well. And we can't talk about seafaring without mentioning Davey Jones at least once. And he was actually considered the chief of the evil spirits in the deep. And seeing him in the rigging actually meant a hurricane or shipwreck was on the way. And the seabed then became known as Davey Jones' Locker, where he gathered the souls of any victims. I'm not going to add that much more about Davey Jones here because I sort of feel like he deserves his own episode at some point. So if you would like me to do a Davey Jones episode, then please do let me know and just send me a message and I'll see about getting that sorted. But we've talked a lot about shipwrecks and so on and trying to avoid a shipwreck. So we are going to close this episode out with phantom ships. And Cornwall in particular seemed to boast a bit of a 19th century tradition of seeing phantom ships. And some of these ones in Cornwall appeared to actually sail over land the same way that they would move over the sea. And seeing one of these was apparently an omen that a wreck would happen. Clearly we have obviously looked at things like these more recently with that ship that was portrayed in the press where it looked like it was floating above the sea, and sometimes you can get strange apparitions like that and it's just like atmospheric conditions and so on. So it is entirely possible that there is actually an optical explanation for that particular phenomenon. But in general, phantom ship tales feature the reenactment of a wreck, and the ships usually appear on the anniversary of their sinking near to the spot where they sank. So as an example, 13 Navy warships were apparently swept off course onto the Goodwin Sands near Kent in 1703, killing most of the crew. People had then reported seeing one of them, the warship Northumberland, some 50 years later, and in this particular vision it appeared that the crew were actually jumping off onto the sands as they apparently did at the time during the original wreckage. Now, meanwhile, one of the most famous legends around the Goodwin Sands is that of the Lady Loverbond, which apparently wrecked on the sands on 13th of February 1748. Now, as the story goes, the captain had brought his new bride on board for a wedding voyage. Unfortunately, the mate also loved her and in a fit of jealousy ran the ship aground during the wedding feast. All on board drowned, and many believed that the vessel still appeared on stormy nights. Some claim to hear the sounds of the wedding feast whenever it appeared. Others claim that the ship was actually seen again every 50 years in 1798, 1848 and 1898. Now, clearly this obviously makes for a good story because you've got drama, you've got a spurned lover, you've got a reenactment every 50 years, just around about Valentine's Day, but it is entirely worth noting that no one can actually find any records of either the ship or its sinking. So it is possible that the story was invented and then placing it on Valentine's Day gives it a little bit extra nudge towards that ghoulish yet romantic side, which obviously the author was originally intending. And clearly we couldn't end this episode without mentioning perhaps the most famous phantom ship of them all, and this is the Flying Dutchman. Now, the first report of the Flying Dutchman actually appeared in 1821 in Blackwood's magazine, which claimed that the ship's captain Van der Decken swore to get round the Cape of Good Hope even if he had to sail until Judgment Day. Now, obviously the devil was listening and cursed the ship to do exactly that. So for anyone after that, seeing the ship was a bad omen, despite the lack of evidence of a real ship behind the story. And in a lot of ways, the Flying Dutchman has become sort of so much bigger than this legend that it's amazing how many articles I actually found in the British newspaper archives where crews had said, yes, we've seen the Flying Dutchman. And one of these was actually as recent as 1914 in the Teignmouth Post, and a ship called the Delmont collided with the Flying Dutchman near Rio. The crew claimed that a phantom full-rigged ship ran down their vessel, and they also claimed to smell brimstone after the collision and noticed a red glow on the surface of the sea for around about half an hour afterwards. And their fears were confirmed when the ship's cat Jeremiah hid in the hold and refused to come on deck. Now, it should be noted that older sailors identified the other ship as being far too modern to be the Flying Dutchman, and the sailors from the apparent ghost ship, when they were asked what vessel they were aboard, actually named their vessel as the Esmeralda. So it's unlikely that it was actually the Flying Dutchman, but it's interesting that even in 1914, sailors were still saying, we've seen the Flying Dutchman. And an article in the Weekly Journal in 1907 explained how an isolated rock off the Cape of Good Hope had actually been identified as the source of the legend. Only visible during storms, experts thought that sailors mistook the rock for a ship in distress. That obviously wouldn't explain why somebody then believed that they saw the ship off Rio, but there we go. And I think the Flying Dutchman has then basically gone on to inspire so many other stories. It's appeared in so many films and books and video games and everything else. It has really taken on a life of its own. So if there wasn't a Flying Dutchman before, it sort of feels like there is one now because it exists so strongly in the popular consciousness. So what do we really make of all these seafaring superstitions? Well, as I said at the beginning, they're intended to provide a sense of control. And if you take particular actions in a specified way, it gives the appearance of an ability to hold misfortune at bay. Of course, the point of superstitions is that every time you do them and the bad thing doesn't happen, it seems as though the practice worked, which is essentially just confirmation bias. But in the terms of seafaring, superstitions that appeared to avert tragedy would then become regular practice. Over time, better navigation and weather forecasting, along with more advanced vessels, made many of these superstitions redundant, and even the ghost ships appear to be seen less frequently, with their reenactments a fragment of folklore rather than a much anticipated event. Still, if you're out at the coast one stormy night, maybe gaze out to sea for a while. Who knows what you might see? And that is the end of this week's episode. I hope that you enjoyed that. Next week we're going to move on to air travel because it just seemed like the most logical other form of transportation to have a look at, given I do already have an exclusive episode about haunted railways and railway lore if you become a member of my Fabulous Folklore family over on Patreon. Obviously, if you do decide to come and join us and help support the podcast financially, then you do get a whole host of bonuses, and there's loads of extra content and bonus episodes, illustrated talks and articles and so on for you to get your teeth into. So it would be lovely to see you over there at some point. If Patreon support is a little bit beyond you at the moment, remember you can always buy me a coffee, which the link is below, and you can also just write a review or recommend the podcast to a friend. They are still very valuable things that you can do to show your support. But anyway, without any further ado, I hope that you enjoyed this week's episode. I hope that you come back next week for air travel. For December, we are going to be moving on to spectral creatures. So expect things like the will-o'-the-wisp and black shuck and creatures of that ilk. And then I've got a whole host of stuff planned for 2022, including some other listener requests as well. So you can expect all kinds of marvellous things then as well. So I hope that you have an absolutely smashing week ahead, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.